Alright, so for shot number 1, I think that the lighting here is fine. We can leave it as is. It does the trick, does the job, and it's looking fairly dynamic as is, so I'm fairly happy with it there. So all we really need to do now is set up our compositing settings to make this shot really stand out, and then also move on to rendering and setting up all of the final render settings of our scenes. So first up, let's actually create a test render. So if we go over to the render properties tab here, and if we hit F12, that's going to create our test render for us. So straight away I can see we do actually need to do some work on the lights here, but now we can move over to the compositing workspace. So if we just close out of this and come up here to the compositing workspace, we can start making some changes here to make this thing really stand out and pop on screen. So if we come up to use nodes, we'll be able to see that we've got a couple nodes here that can help us start compositing a couple things in. So first off, we need to create a viewer node so we can see what we're doing. So if you hit Control Shift and click on the render layers, you'll see that we now have the viewer node here. I'm just going to move that across to there. And right now the image is super zoomed in. So to zoom out, you can just hit V on your keyboard. That'll zoom it out. If you want to zoom back in, you can hit Alt V. That'll zoom you in. But let's just leave it as that for now. So very quickly, I'm just going to add in a lens distortion node. And basically what this is going to do is it's going to enable chromatic aberration for us. So if I change this dispersion here to something like 0.5, you'll see we've got these crazy chromatic aberrations around the sides of the bottle. We obviously don't need it to be that extreme, so I'm just going to change it to something like 0.025. That's not quite enough for my liking, so I'm just going to change this to something like 0.05. There we go, and now you can see there's some very slight chromatic aberration happening at the back here. So that's definitely going to elevate the final shot once we get there. Right now we're only viewing this, however, so we need to add this to the composite node. So if we move that over to there, it's now going to actually appear in our final renders. Great, so now that that's all set up, we can move back to the layout and we can fix up the lighting here and make it a little bit more dynamic. So first things first, I think we need to add in a light here at the front, an area light. So I'm just going to move that up, bring it in front here, and have it basically pointing at all three of them, like so. And we're basically going to do the same as before. We're going to change this to something like 300. Not too bad. Maybe we'll go 250. A little bit less intense. I'm going to change this to an ellipse instead of a square. And now from here, I'm just going to give another quick test render and see how that's looking. Alright, that's looking pretty nice. What I might do just quickly is I'm actually going to change the focal length of the camera. I'd like it to have a little bit more of perspective to it. So something like, let's go with 85. That's looking a lot nicer. So with that change of focal length, I'm just going to adjust some of the keyframes I've created. There we go. That's looking pretty nice already. And as you can see from the test renders here, it's looking not too bad at all. I'm just going to quickly change one thing for the material of this Red Bull can. I'm seeing from this view here, it's not as metallic as I'd like it to be. So I'm just going to go over to the shading tab and quickly on the Red Bull can texture, making sure that I'm on it here. I'm just going to change this from specular and just unplug that and see if that elevates the shot at all. Alrighty, and I'm also just seeing here on the fingerprints texture, I'm just going to move it from slot 2 to slot 1. Alright, that's looking much better. I'm just going to close this off now. And I'm just going to change the material on the backdrop one more time. And actually just decrease the roughness just slightly to something around 0.6. Awesome. Okay, so now we're ready to start rendering and lock in those final render settings. So if we come back to layout here, come across to the render settings. All we really need to enable right now is ambient occlusion, bloom, screen space reflections, and motion blur, which should already be enabled. We can check on depth of field and change this a little bit if we want to, but for right now, the depth of field that we have on the camera is doing all of the work for us. If we want to change a little bit more of the look, we can. So if we don't want a very high contrast look, we can change that to very low contrast. This part's totally up to you. I enjoy the look of the high contrast. And you can also change the exposure as well as the gamma. I'm going to leave it as is, but it's there if you want to play around with it. So lastly, we just need to set up the render output and the resolution and dimensions of our first shot. So first up, it's going to put the images that you're rendering into a temporary folder on your hard drive. I recommend finding a folder that works for you, something easily accessible, as we're going to be compositing all of this in DaVinci Resolve. I've just created a folder for it to output all the images to, just named it Shot 1. So from here, you can decide how you want to actually render this out. So if you want to render it as an image sequence, which I highly recommend, you can just leave it as is. You can leave it as file format PNG, leave all of this stuff down here, and as long as the resolution is as you wish, we're all good to go. So we're going to be rendering from frame 1 and then ending at frame 85. And then the frame rate is 24 frames per second. And to render your animation, you can either come up here to render and hit render animation, or you can hit Control F12 and that will start the rendering process. So I'm going to hit Control F12 and render this out now. There we go, so the scene has finished rendering. Now what we can do for the final composite in DaVinci Resolve, to get that change in backdrop where it zooms out here, it's very simple. All we need to do is change the material here of the backdrop. So if we go to shading, we'll just change the material to white. Something like that. And now we just need to find the frame where it starts to zoom backwards. So here seems good, 74. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to change the timeline to 74, and to start at frame 74 and end at frame 85. And we're just going to render these frames out again. And instead of the black backdrop being there, it's going to automatically, once we composite everything and bring it into DaVinci Resolve, it'll automatically make that transition for us. So if you hit Control F12, that'll render out and we can continue on to shot 2. Alright, so that's completed its rendering process. So now I'm just going to move over to shot 2 up here in the scenes. And we're basically going to do that whole process again. So for compositing, fortunately it hasn't copied across the composite nodes for us. So what we can do is come up here to shot 1. And if we just copy a box like this, Control C to copy that, come back over to shot 2. And as long as we have used nodes enabled up here, we can just Control V and paste it in here. And it's basically just copied it all across for us. So now if we go back to our layout here, check out our scene. Right now it's looking okay. It's also copied across the white backdrop. So I'm just going to quickly change that back to the black backdrop in the shading section. Like so. So it's looking good, but I think we could use a bit more light in the scene. So first thing I want to do is bring this light above the cans, like so. And I kind of want it to animate across the scene with the cans, kind of like this. So already, I mean, that's looking much more dynamic. I'm just going to bring it down a little bit more so it's got a bit more of a dramatic effect to it. That's looking pretty good. And I think that's actually going to be the final setup for the lights for this shot, as it's looking pretty dynamic. And that is the exact same lighting setup that I had for the initial shot that I created. So now it's just a matter of creating the folder for your shot to render out to. And then we can move on to shot 3. Okay, so I've created a new folder for my shot to render out to. all of the settings should have stayed the same. So before we can render this out, we actually have to change the compositing nodes to have this scene as its active scene. So all you need to do is come over to the compositing tab, come down here and change it from shot 1 to shot 2. And now when you render, it will, instead of rendering the previous shot, it's going to render this shot, like so. So now all you have to do is render this out with Ctrl F12 and we're good to go to shot number 3. Alright, so now we can move on to shot number 3 with that out of the way. So let's come up here, change this over to shot 3. And now we can work on the lighting for this scene and polishing up this shot. So first off, let's go to the compositing node and let's just copy in, so hit use nodes, so we can delete these 2 nodes first and then paste in those ones from the previous shot, and then finally just change this over to shot number 3. So now let's come back out to the layout tab, and now we can start polishing the lighting before we actually start rendering this out. So first off, I'm just going to grab this light at the back here and pull it up so it sort of gives it a halo effect around the back here. And for this shot, there's going to be 3 changes of color tone. So the first will be black, then it's going to change to yellow, then red, then blue. So we basically just want to set up the timeline, so we'll split it into 4 sections. So for the first 18 frames, it's going to be a black backdrop. So we'll just change this to 18, and we'll come over to our render output settings here, create the output folder, and then we'll render these 18 frames out. So Ctrl F12 to render, and then we'll move on to the other backdrops. Alright, so now we can click on the backdrop here and change the color. So if we go over to the shading tab, let's just bring its color up, and we'll just pick a yellow here to start with. Something like that looks pretty good. So we'll go with that, come back to the layout, and I'm just going to change the start frame from 1 to 18, and we'll end it on frame 36. And now we'll just render out these coming frames. Alrighty, now that's done, we're just going to repeat the process. So back to the shading tab, we'll change this over to more of a red, and we'll come back and we'll change this over to end on frame 54 and start from frame 36. Now we can just hit Ctrl F12 and render these frames out. Alright, and now lastly for the blue backdrop. So back to the shading tab, let's change this over to a blue. Something like that seems pretty good. Now back to the layout, I'm just going to change this from ending from 54, change that to 72, and then we'll make it start on 54. Now all we've got to do is render it out and we're good to go on to shot number 4. Alrighty, so that's all completed now. So that's shot number 3 done. We can move on to shot number 4 now and finish out the process of rendering. So let's go up to scenes here. We'll change over to shot 4. And now that we're here, all we really need to do is repeat what we've done with these last 3 shots. So let's go over to the compositing tab. We'll just hit use nodes. Going to delete these 2 and paste in the ones from the previous scene. And then finally, I'm just going to change this over to be linked to shot number 4. So now that that's done, let's go over to the shading tab and let's change the material here back to a black, like so. And now let's go back to the layout and play with the lighting until it's something that we enjoy. I'm just going to remove this light here at the front as it's just sort of floating there and not doing much. And I am going to add another light in, an area light. I'm going to bring that way in front here, and I'm just going to point it at the can, and I'm also going to increase its power to something like 200. and also change its shape to be an ellipse. Let's increase that power to something a little bit more drastic. I'm also going to make it a little larger by scaling it. It's looking pretty good. I might try, so I'm just going to bring it in a little closer to the can here. I'm just playing around with the power and the settings of this light. So that's looking okay. I think I might even just add another light in, just copying this one, so Shift D to duplicate it. Bring it in fairly close to the Red Bull can. And we're definitely going to diminish its power to something like 200. There we go. That's looking fairly decent. With this area light, I've just scaled it on the Z axis. So I'm just going to press Shift T and aim that more at the can there. And that's looking pretty decent. So what I'm going to do now is just make that output folder again for the frames to render out to. And then from there we can jump into DaVinci Resolve and finish this whole Skillshare course off. And you'll have a sweet product render available to you. Alright, so now with all of that out of the way, we can save our project and move over to DaVinci Resolve and get started on the compositing workflow there.